In a small corner of Rome, among ancient clocks and teacups, unfolds a story of courage that defied oceans and prejudices. In the wrinkles of Adjora and Lorenzo, each line tells a chapter of an extraordinary journey that began with a letter and blossomed against all odds. In the small house in Trastevere, the wall clock marks the hours with a cadence as familiar as Adjora's own heartbeat. The gentle aroma of herbal tea blends with the nostalgic scent of the old wood of the furniture that has witnessed decades of silent stories. At 82, Adjora walks with measured steps down the hallway, one hand resting on the railing worn smooth by the touch of generations, while the other holds a colorful shawl that she embroidered herself many winters ago. From the living room window, she observes Lorenzo, her companion of 8 decades of life, seated in his favorite armchair. At 85, his body thin and slightly hunched, he leafs through an old theology book, glasses balanced on the tip of his nose. The afternoon light bathes his white hair, creating a soft halo around his serene figure. It is the same place where he spent entire mornings reading and making notes when he still taught at the university. On the walls, photographs in simple frames tell the story of this improbable family. The humble wedding in a small neighborhood church, the 3 children in different phases of life, the smiling grandchildren, and more recently, the great-grandchildren who bring new freshness to the old house. To a casual observer, they may seem like just ordinary portraits of a traditional Italian family. But Adjora knows that each image carries the weight of an extraordinary journey, a crossing that defied oceans, prejudices, and conventions. In the kitchen, Adjora prepares more tea, her wrinkled and time-marked hands still agile as she handles the old copper kettle. In a small carved wooden box, kept on the highest shelf, rests the worn rosary that belonged to her mother, a relic from her previous life, when the horizon of Abuja seemed to be the limit of her dreams. On the other side of the city, Chiara Vital, now 87 years old, gets ready for her weekly visit to her brother-in-law and sister-in-law's house. Widowed for over 30 years, she found in Adjora not just a relative by marriage, but a true sister. The rumors of the past, which almost destroyed the couple's happiness, have long since faded away. But the memory of those difficult days still serves as a silent reminder of the fragility of reputations and the strength of true love. That same afternoon, Matteo, Lorenzo's nephew and a respected 58-year-old doctor, will arrive with his family for Sunday dinner. Raised as a son by the couple during difficult periods of his childhood, he bears facial features of his uncle, especially around the eyes, where kindness seems to reside permanently. And Rosa, the couple's youngest daughter, 45 years old, will certainly bring her 3 boisterous children and a new notebook, continuing her father's tradition of capturing thoughts in pages that will one day tell her own story. Adjora's memory travels back to the past, to the young seamstress she once was, bent over colorful fabrics in a small shop in Abuja. It was at this time, when her hands created beauty from scraps, that her heart began to trace an unexpected path toward a destiny she could never have imagined. In those days, letters still carried the weight of true feelings, imprinted on paper and ink. Lorenzo was a young seminarian in Rome, dedicated to theological studies and the service of faith. As part of his work, he responded to queries sent by African Catholic communities during virtual retreats. It was on one of these occasions that Adjora sent a question that seemed simple, but carried the full complexity of her soul. How do you find courage when fear seems greater than faith? The answer she received was not the usual theological explanation, but something unexpectedly personal. Lorenzo wrote about his own doubts, about moments when he felt the weight of uncertainty. Courage is not the absence of fear, he wrote, but the certainty that something is more important than the fear itself. Those words created an invisible bridge between 2 worlds. In the following weeks, they exchanged increasingly frequent correspondences. He spoke of the light in ancient churches in Rome. She described the warmth of the African sun. He sent reflections on sacred texts. She replied with observations about everyday life and the hope she found in small acts of kindness. Gradually, they realized that this connection transcended the initial purpose. There was in the subtext a kind of calling that religious words couldn't fully express, a mutual admiration, a deep respect, and a silent desire to share more than just written words. When Adjora, in an act of courage that surprised even herself, mentioned that she was saving for a pilgrimage to Rome, Lorenzo felt an inner tremor that he couldn't explain. It was as if, after years dedicated to texts and theories about the divine, he was confronted with something unexpectedly human and real. Adjora's journey was an odyssey of determination. Endless days on buses crossing dusty roads, suspicious borders, strange looks. She carried little more than a few clothes, her mother's rosary, and Lorenzo's carefully folded letters. The route linking Nigeria to Italy seemed endless deserts, seas, mountains, each kilometer a testament to her resolve. The first meeting took place in a stone courtyard, beside an ancient fountain. It was a damp winter day, and Lorenzo waited nervously, a book of poems in his hands as a sign of recognition. When he saw Adjora approaching, shy but determined in her simple dress, he felt something that no seminary could have taught him, the certainty that some presences are not coincidences, but predestined encounters. There were no grand declarations at that first moment, just simple gestures. He noticed she was trembling with cold and offered her his scarf. She accepted with a contained smile. They walked side by side, talking about mundane things, the different taste of Italian water, the cobblestone streets so distinct from the roads of her homeland, the way Italians gestured while speaking. In the following weeks, Lorenzo showed her a Rome that wasn't in the postcards. Small churches hidden in narrow alleys, bustling markets where elderly ladies haggled over the price of tomatoes, tranquil squares where pigeons and memories coexisted in peace. And they discovered, step by step, that love that grows between such deep differences of culture, history, experiences is nurtured more by patient listening than by grand promises. Adjora found temporary work as a seamstress in a small tailor shop. Lorenzo continued his studies, but now with a new sparkle in his eyes that did not go unnoticed by his fellow seminarians. There was a contained happiness in his gestures, as if he carried a luminous secret. Then the shadow appeared, unexpected and cruel. In a local newspaper, a photograph, Lorenzo embracing a woman in front of a hospital. The caption insinuated an improper relationship with a married woman. It was Chiara, the wife of his recently deceased brother, whom Lorenzo had accompanied during an emergency related to a high-risk pregnancy. The news spread like wildfire. The Roman Curia, always vigilant for possible scandals, temporarily suspended his activities to investigate the case. The fellow seminarians, who had been friendly until then, began to avoid him. And Adjora, still insecure in a foreign land, felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. For weeks, they were forced to keep their distance. Lorenzo, bound by the rules of the ecclesiastical investigation, could not defend her nor explain himself. Adjora, alone and confused, nearly returned to Nigeria, convinced that she had made a mistake in believing she could build a life so far from her roots. It was months of painful silence, of growing rumors, until the truth finally emerged. The photo captured a moment of pure compassion when Lorenzo supported Chiara, pregnant and widowed, during a complication that threatened her baby. Far from a scandal, it was an act of family kindness that, out of context, had been distorted by the malice of others. When they were finally able to meet again, the words were sparse but deep. Lorenzo simply took Adjora's hands in his and said, "Not everything that falls into the mud gets dirty. Sometimes it's the mud that is purified by the contact." She understood even before he finished the sentence, and forgave him with a silence more eloquent than any speech. The journey back to mutual trust and community respect was slow and arduous. Lorenzo decided to leave the seminary, not by imposition, but by his own choice. He realized that his calling was different, that there was a different way to serve and live his faith. He began teaching theology in parochial schools, finding a new purpose in education. Adjora continued her work with sewing, now with a growing clientele who admired her unique talent for blending African techniques with Italian elegance. She created a small atelier at home, where fabrics, threads, and needles danced between her skillful hands. They were married in a simple ceremony, in a neighborhood church decorated with wildflowers. There was no luxury, just the genuine presence of a few true friends who had remained by their side during difficult times. The rosary that had belonged to Ajora's mother was carefully tied to the modest bridal bouquet, and Lorenzo kept as a relic the scarf she wore on the day they met, silent symbols of an improbable journey. Life took its course, with the joys and challenges that all families face. They had 3 children, raised among books and songs, between Italian stories and African tales. They grew old together, learning to value both words and silences. He taught Italian and Latin. She prepared traditional Nigerian dishes adapted to local ingredients. They laughed at cultural differences and secretly prided themselves on having transformed the improbable into the everyday. Time, that relentless master, was generous in some aspects and cruel in others. It took friends, siblings, and gradually began taking some memories as well. Lorenz, always so precise with dates and references, now sometimes confused names of places or people. But he never forgot the distinctive sound of Ajora's needle working on some embroidery in the next room. That steady rhythm that marked the soundtrack of their shared life. On a quiet autumn afternoon, as golden leaves slowly fell over the small garden, Ajora and Lorenzo's youngest great-grandson, a curious boy with bright eyes, asked while flipping through an old photo album, "Nano, how did Baisnana get here?" Lorenzo looked at Ajora, his tired eyes meeting hers across the room. A silent smile, full of memories, passed between them like an invisible electric current. It was she who responded, her soft voice carrying the slight accent that never completely disappeared. "By bus, my dear, and by faith, but that's another story." The boy laughed, amused by the simple answer, not understanding the depth hidden in those unpretentious words. A journey of days that turned into a lifetime. When the house finally falls asleep, and the silence of the night envelops Trastevere like a cloak, Ajora watches her husband asleep in his armchair, a book still open on his lap. The decades have bent his body, but not diminished his essence. She runs her fingers over the old rosary that she now keeps in the small wooden box, an object that has become a symbol, a tangible bridge between her past and her present. On the opposite wall, framed in dark wood, there is a black and white photograph of 2 young people smiling in front of a small church. He, in a suit too simple for the day, she in a white dress she sewed during nights of anticipation. They seem almost like children now, seen through the lens of time. And in this moment suspended between memory and silence, Ajora feels the certainty that never needed to be verbalized. The greatest promises are not fulfilled with grand words, but with constant presence, with waking up each morning and choosing the same love again, the same path, the same person day after day, year after year, until time is no longer measured in hours, but in shared memories. Matteo arrives for an unscheduled visit the following afternoon, carrying with him the aroma of fresh coffee and freshly baked bread. A dedicated doctor, he learned the value of knowledge from Uncle Lorenzo and the importance of compassion from Ajora. He observes the elderly couple with a mix of admiration and gratitude, remembering how they welcomed him during the most difficult moments of his childhood. "I was organizing some old documents," he says, placing a small box on the table. "I found these letters. I thought you might like to see them." They are the first correspondences exchanged between Ajora and Lorenzo, yellowed by time but perfectly preserved. She touches the paper with reverence, recognizing the careful handwriting that now trembles slightly when her husband attempts to write. Lorenz puts on his glasses and examines the letters. For a moment, the fog of age seems to lift, and his eyes shine with the same intensity they had decades ago. "I remember this one," he says, holding a page delicately. "It was when you described the sunset in Abuja. I would close my eyes and could see the colors." Rosa arrives shortly after, her hurried steps echoing down the stairs. At 45, she is the living image of her mother when she was young, with the same talent for sewing and the same quiet determination. She brings with her a new notebook, where she records thoughts and observations, a habit inherited from her father. "We're all gathered here today," Ajora smiles. "What a nice surprise." As the family settles in the living room, Lorenzo, in a rare moment of complete clarity, begins to tell the grandchildren a story they had never heard in full. the true saga of Adjora's journey across the African continent to Europe. There were 4 different buses, Adjora recalls, her eyes distant, reliving those days of uncertainty and courage. The last one broke down halfway. We waited 2 days until they could fix it. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren listened fascinated to this story that had always been there, in the subtleties of their existence, but never fully told. They understand, perhaps for the first time, that the quiet love they always witnessed between their grandparents was not just the natural result of time, but the daily achievement of 2 hearts that chose to walk together against all odds. As the sun begins to set, casting golden shadows through the window, Lorenzo takes Adjora's hand in his, a gesture repeated thousands of times over the years, but one that has never lost its meaning. "Do you know what the cardinal said when we decided to get married?" he asks, his voice low but clear. Adjora smiles, well aware of the story, "That we were crazy." "And what did you reply?" Lorenzo's eyes sparkle with the memory. "That the madness of love is the only possible wisdom in this world." The family laughs, and in that moment of perfect harmony, it's understood that some journeys never really end. They just transform, like rivers that change course but continue flowing, carrying the same essential water from the source to the sea. When night finally falls over Rome, and the stars appear one by one in the sky over Trastevere, the Vital House remains illuminated not only by the modest lamps, but by the silent glow of a story that began with a simple question about fear and courage, and transformed into a lifetime of answers discovered together, day by day, in every shared dawn.